my question to you ultimately, James, is have you thought about it and what would you do in this situation? Would you agree to do it?
Knowing what we know as a whole, the idea of cryogenically freezing my brain and potentially having it be revived later and a new body built, everything like that, yes. Now, the very specific parameters of this happening.
Welcome, friends, to episode 308 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we finish out both the book and show versions of the three-body problem. All right, James, so what a meaty one we have in terms of just raw topics, concepts. There's so many things that we could spend an hour talking about, I feel like, in here. And yet we also have to discuss a bunch of narrative stuff. So this is going to be a one where I just feel like we're lightly touching on a bunch of things that I really would love to talk about in depth. But just to keep things manageable, we're going to have to kind of move through them quickly. But yeah, how are you feeling about this one?
I had a journey with this project, right? We started out with this dense, translated sci-fi novel. We only read half of it. I felt like I was kind of lost in the sauce a little bit, like trying to figure out what the point of the story was really, like all the way through. And then we went and watched a complicated, I would say less complicated, but still a complicated show, 4 episodes of that. And then this week we're here to cover the last 4 episodes and the last part technically of the first book. And man, I really find myself at the end of this, having read the book now and having watched the show, even with the stuff we talked about last week, which I recommend people check out if they haven't for more context and other things we'll talk about. Coming in, there was a bit of baggage with the filmmakers here for me. And I'm on the other side of it now saying, like, I want more of this. I thought this was really fascinating. And I thought that the Double D's and Alexander Wu were able to pull off something that I didn't necessarily know they were going to be able to in the first half of the show. I think it got really emotional, which I wasn't necessarily anticipating. And then it also has this big like oomph of like story that I guess we would credit to Cixin Liu, because it's just like the way that he left the story, and it's kind of like ripe for more.
Yeah, totally, man. I agree. I went through a journey with this as well. Like this book came so heavily recommended that I was a little like, I don't know if I'm liking this as much as I've heard. Like, there's a lot of cool concepts in here. I'm not like necessarily connecting with the characters super closely. But even the cool concepts were like, it was just a few that really intrigued me. And then a lot of stuff that was just kind of confusing me. And I wasn't seeing how it was going to come together into something that I was going to be into. And I will admit, even by the end of book 1, I still had a bit of that. But I definitely got some more. But like the show goes farther than the book does, and I'm going to discuss that here in a second. But really between the two, like this is one where I highly recommend reading and watching together if you're the kind of person who's willing to do that, because I felt like each enriched the experience of the other.
Totally.
And I was reading as I was watching. So I would go back to the book like more excited after having watched a little bit to get back into it, because like it kind of made me even more interested. And then also the book adds extra layers of just texture to it, because like a lot of the details in the movie, or sorry, in the show, they can't get into the nitty-gritty as much as they do in the book. So both had a lot of benefits. I ended up walking away like liking both quite a bit. I do think both still have flaws, which we'll discuss, but I'm having a lot of fun with this. And then the thing that really is selling me on it was just how many more concepts come in the second half of these episodes. And I can start to see the shape of this series now. And like, I can imagine what this trilogy might look like. And it's really exciting when I think about that. Like, it's such an ambitious thing to try. And the fact that it's all rooted in like real theoretical science, like a lot of this stuff is like very cutting edge, like maybe this could be possible. They're taking it and they're making it into a like coherent story that is really fun to follow and has huge stakes, like world ending stakes. So like, I'm so in on this. I'm really, really loving it. And yes, I still will be critical at times, because I think there are things to critique here. It's not perfect by any stretch. But yeah, ultimately having a lot of fun with it.
I mentioned either last week or the week before how this is a big mystery. Like, everything's being doled out to us in this mystery format. Yeah. And it felt like Liu went in to tell the story and was like, I'm going to set all this up and then scientifically in this last part tell you exactly how this is possible.
Yeah.
And it really was satisfying.
It was a magic trick. It's funny to say this, but magic trick in the sense that like real world magicians pull off magic tricks, right? There is an explanation, you just don't see how it's done. He was doing that, right? Where we were doing things where it's like, I don't know how this is possible. And then the reveal would be like, no, there's this real theory about something that could be possible, and I've extrapolated out what I'm showing you from that. And that stuff is so cool, and that's like when hard sci-fi is at its best, I think. And I can see why people who love hard sci-fi really love this series.
Definitely. I think that last week I made a mention of like trying to have it both ways and playing with like fantasy elements in a sci-fi show. And I think in a pretty satisfying way, Liu brought that back around. And I do think it's pretty rewarding to like stick around for the theories. Like they can seem pretty big at first, but as he starts to dig into them, I think he, even for myself, who I consider myself a pretty layman in terms of scientific theory, I could follow along and really like grapple onto the concept and like extrapolate out kind of where he's going with it, like you said. So yeah, I would say it's a really rewarding and interesting read for anybody who's interested in that like hard sci-fi.
Also, sometimes gut reaction can lead you astray because some of these concepts feel impossible. But when you start looking into them, it's like there's some meat on the bones here of like this could maybe be how it would work. We're kind of peering past what some people call the technological singularity, in the idea of like a technology so advanced that we can't currently conceive of it, right? And that's what these aliens potentially have, and that's what Liu is playing with. And he's peering past that and proposing what things might look like. And so, of course, it's going to seem almost impossible and magical, but that's kind of like the whole point of that. I do want to talk about one thing real quick before we move any further. We had a really helpful comment on our last video, and that was by Roast Pork 5437. And they basically, I'm not going to read it verbatim, but they broke it down and said that the show, our Oxford 5, are all actually representative of real characters from the series. So we thought that they were maybe splitting Wong into 5 characters, and that's not really what's happening. So in book 1, you get Augie Salazar as Wong, essentially, Dr. Ye, Mike Evans, and Vera. Those are all so they have been renamed. Some of them, like they all these characters are Chinese in the book, but we recognize that, right? Like we reread about all these characters as we went. But in book 2, a version of Saul Durand and Raj are both introduced. And then in book 3, Jin Zhang, Thomas Wade, Jack Rooney, and Will Downing. Again, not named that, but versions of these characters appear who have, I assume, similar things happening to them. And because of this, he says that in these last few episodes, like episodes 1 through 5 is all book 1, but episodes 6 and 7 deals with a few chapters from book 3, and episode 8 also deals with a few chapters from book 3 and a few from chapter 2 or from book 2. So anyway, the Double D's, like they went further into the series and pulled some things forward, and I think the show is better for it because it felt to me like at the end of book 1, it was a lot of setup, but it felt like I was kind of just like really wanting to get into book 2 because it felt like now we finally are going to start moving on this plot. And I think they wanted to include some of that in the show very smartly. And I think that sets up a season 2 even better, in my opinion.
Yeah, there is a part, and I know you can, I think after you've seen the show and if you've read the book, you kind of know exactly where things are cutting off. And I felt it in the show. As soon as the shift into the other material happened, I was like, oh, cool. This is definitely from another book. I was hoping, at least, I was hoping they weren't going completely off script because, you know, mixed reaction to that with them, but
right. Not their own inventions. Very pointedly, these are things from the books. And once again, these characters, which I had thought were maybe creations of the writing team here, are not actually. They're just interpretations of other characters that just show up in later novels. So that was really interesting to note. So thank you for commenting that. If people ever have any comments like that, like clarifying something, definitely let us know. Like we're always curious to hear that. And one of the weaknesses of the way we do this kind of coverage, like we get benefits of it, right? We haven't read on, so we can be kind of genuinely surprised by things as we encounter them. But one of the weaknesses is we don't see stuff like that because there's no way for us to know we haven't read book 2 and 3 yet. So it's always helpful to get notes like that.
Yeah, thanks for writing in. And honestly, I love hearing another perspective anytime somebody wants to write in, if they agree or don't or disagree with what we're saying, or if they have input.
Does that change your look at all on or review at all on these characters, knowing that they actually do exist in the books?
I think so. Yeah. I think
Yeah.
some, by the end of the season, I kind of saw why they were included. It felt like
Yeah.
at the beginning there was some redundancy going on with the characters in the first like 4 episodes. But as soon as like everyone had their own path and they were
Yeah, they all finally sort of had their own thing going on that made them all seem worthwhile. Yeah, I agree. One other thing I do want to do before we get into it, we're going to quickly move into the episodes here. Last episode, I want to give myself a minor correction. I talked about the Dark Forest hypothesis, and I said, oh, it's really interesting that the second book is called the Dark Forest because clearly it's referencing this hypothesis. Well, the Dark Forest hypothesis is named that because of this book. The concept of the dangerous universe where, maybe civilizations are hiding is not new, but Liu actually coined that phrase. So the reason that it's called that is from that book, which is pretty cool to hear. So it was kind of funny for me to be like, well, it's really telling that it's named that. It's like, yeah, because people read that and they're like, that's a good name for it.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Anyway, I thought that was pretty cool. Are you ready to move into it? Because we got a lot to talk about with these episodes, man. And stay tuned. I have a game I want to play that's an old classic for our podcast. So I'll bring that up here
Very
in a little
nice.
bit.
It's been a while. I think I know where you're going with that.
Yeah.
All right. So episode 5 is called Judgment Day. Clarence interrogates Ye Wenji, who claims the Santi allowed her to be captured because she is no longer useful to them. Evan's ship Judgment Day is scheduled to go through the Panama Canal. Wade enlists Augie and a Royal Navy team headed by Raj, Jin's boyfriend, to obtain the data on board. Augie's nanofibers are used in an ambush to horizontally slice through the ship, killing everyone on board, including Evans. Wade's team locates the data disk and tries to decrypt it, which the Santi allow. Wade plays Ye Wenji the recording of the Santi's confusion over humanity's ability to lie. Jin and Wade open a file in the data disk using the VR headsets. They learn the Santi are using high-dimensional proton supercomputers called sophons to cause the anomalous effects observed in particle accelerators. The Santi liaison details how the Santi intend to cripple Earth's scientific advancement, preventing humans from technologically surpassing them by the time of their arrival. Shortly after, all electronic devices around the world display the message, "You are bugs." A sophon envelopes the world, forming a giant eye on its body, revealing the existence and power of the Santi to the world.
I think there are just 2 major things we talk about here, move through each of them, and I think it'll be interesting to make some comparisons to the book, because things are a little different.
Yeah.
First off, we got to talk about the nano web, the cheese slicer is how I was thinking of it. It was such a wild thing to watch.
I mean, they did full Game of Thrones like brutality in this, right?
It was fucking brutal. It reminded me of honestly, I kept thinking of Resident Evil. You seen the first Resident Evil?
Yeah.
Where they go through that laser trap and like
Yep.
it has a similar kind of effect, but like this was like even scarier because you could never see anything because it was nano, so it was so tiny. Man, that was like fucking wild. I watched this episode. I watched episode 5. I had read some of the part 3, but I hadn't gotten to this part yet. And I watched this and I was like, well, shit. Like, I don't know if you remember all the way back in episode 1, I mentioned that like this was that I was like, we're going to see this at some point. I did not know it was going to be with the fucking tanker. That was wild. But I was like, oh, I kind of called this. I wonder how it'll go down in the books. I was like, this feels very Hollywood. So I was like, did maybe Liu leave it as a dangling thread and they came in and wanted to like, this is something that they wanted to do just because it would look cool. But no, it happens in the book. It just, we don't follow it as we don't follow it from the perspectives of somebody on the ship. It's only Wong witnessing it from the shore. And we see very little of this horrific sequence. This was wild stuff, man. This is like, it's so funny because like we're in this hard sci-fi and like, I guess there is some hard sci-fi concepts going on here. With this hyper strong nanomaterial and like I guess how it would potentially, because it would be unbelievably sharp and like so there's some concepts of like why it would work, but beyond that this is horror, right? Like this is one of the most horrific things.
Shadowy hallways where
terrifying.
Like, little paper mache, like paper cutout things are getting cut in half.
I loved how that looked too.
Yeah.
That's fucking terrifying, man. This is the kind of thing that like if I'd have seen when I was young, I think would have haunted me.
Yeah. This was the episode really too where I was like, oh, this is like an adult show. Like they're really gonna go, like there were some things here and there and the concepts are pretty large, but like I was like, okay, like this is a Weiss and Benioff show, clearly.
Yeah. And as far as set pieces go, like they've done some amazing set pieces on Game of Thrones, obviously. This is a whole different kind of set piece, but man, is it a good one. I love how it was set up with, even though it was like maybe a little obvious, I still thought it was really cool how they were like, it's like, oh, what did you do? It's not working. And she was like, actually, I think it is. And then it just like the slow dawning of like what's
Well,
actually happening and the effects of it.
and I want to talk about how like people tend to create things with the best of intentions, right? Like she built it with the intention of using it for good, and
Yeah.
how that can be co-opted and turned into a weapon often, and like how that like almost art of like creation is then like bent to the will of evil in some ways, and that's what's
Yeah.
happening here. And then we can kind of extrapolate all of that out with the talk of nuclear weaponry. And at first we think that this satellite that's sending messages like in the past is actually, I thought it was a weapon early on, and we get some of the alien tech, and it's kind of the interpretation of weapon versus tool is very, it can be very close together.
Sure. And that's like an ongoing conversation about technology always, right? Like, yeah, you can develop it thinking it's going to be used for good, but like, I don't know, most things, if you want to use it in another way that's not for good or for violence or for whatever, like at the same time that we get the nuclear bomb, we get nuclear energy, right? Like, so many things have been unlocked from, that discovery of how to harness that energy. And yet so much horrific things have happened because of that as well. And as you progress forward into just even wilder and wilder science, like that's going to continue to be the case. So I do like that that's going to be like an ongoing theme here, I think. As far as the set piece goes, I thought this looked great. I think at times, like, I don't know. It's like I don't want to be a visual artist, like, critiquing on stuff. But there's at times where it looked a little bit goofy CGI. I don't know what, something about the Panama Canal looked a little weird with the lighting. Like, there's just certain things. But, like, ultimately, I don't really care about all of that because the concept was cool enough. And I love the way it sort of unfolded like a deck of cards, which was a description right out of the book. I thought that looked really cool. Like, I'm talking about the whole damn ship. My other criticism is just like logistically to me, and this is a criticism for the book too, because this is proposed in the book as like an alternative to like blowing it up or something. So I'm like, how do you know this isn't going to destroy it? Like,
Yeah,
it seems like quite a risk that the drive didn't get sliced or the computers, because they talk about, oh, it'll make a clean cut, but like as we've seen, the whole ship collapsed on itself and fires broke out and like there were explosions and like it could have easily been destroyed. But ultimately, I think the rule of cool wins out here, and it's just like
that's what it is.
I guess it's plausible enough that this would be seen as like a way to do it. But ultimately, it's like it feels like there's probably better ways to do it. But whatever, this is a cool scene.
I mean, there was the nanofiber was set up, so he's gotta bring that to fruition. All right, so talking about plausibility. Let's start talking about high-dimensional proton supercomputers.
Well, wait. Before we leave that, I did also want to note that this nanomaterial in the book, it was talked about as specifically being dangerous because of the creation of something called the space elevator. Which I don't know if you know much about this concept of the space elevator, but this is something that's been around in hard sci-fi for a while. It's been proposed, and there's a lot of talk about it actually being a potential thing that people will want to do in the future. It'll make space travel much easier, be able to get us to orbit without having to use the immense amount of energy of launching a rocket. And so the highly important part of this nanomaterial was that it was going to make a space elevator possible. That's not discussed in the show at all. So I think that's interesting to note. I don't know if that's because they're going to abandon that as just like a complete thing, or if it's like that's not important necessarily to season 1, so we're going to set that aside for now, because they instead focus on this moment, and then they focus on the sail we get later that the nanomaterial makes possible. So I don't know. I thought it was interesting, just worth noting that one of the major reasons that the nanomaterial was considered so dangerous is not even addressed in the show.
Definitely.
But you're right. Let's talk about the supercomputer that exists in 11 dimensions, perhaps, and is the size of a world, but then folds down into the size of a single proton.
So I remember being fascinated with the idea of dimensions when I was a kid. And like clearly we were familiar with 3 dimensions. And I just remember asking teachers and like it's such a complex topic that like you need to understand like physics and geometry and all this other stuff, like non-Euclidean shapes and all these things, that I understand kind of why no one was able to articulate it to me as I wanted it to be, because it's not a simple topic to talk about. But I love the idea of talking about 4th dimension, 5th, 6th dimension, all the way up to 11, and then taking it down to clearly what is I would assume a theory based on what we know about Liu's writing so far, of getting to a quantum level of creation and like getting into something that's not in the macroverse anymore. It's in this like microverse, and how that is in and of itself a different plane of existence that can kind of like break space and time as we know it.
I am so into this stuff, but I do not have a science background, and I will fully admit, once we get into the quantum realm, a lot of this stuff flies over my head. Like, it's interesting, and I try to hear people to explain it, but it's like a lot of the rules and the laws that we accept for general physics do start to break down in the quantum level. Things just behave differently there, and there's lots of theories about why that I cannot explain.
Definitely, yeah. You're not gonna get that out of me either.
Yeah, no. I do know enough to know that the idea of folding something into different dimensions and the idea of a supercomputer. I mean, we already have these like nano computers today, these nano supercomputers, and this is like a whole revolution in computing right now. The main problem we're having, I think, is like cooling them enough. And again, I'm speaking out of my ass a little bit, but it's just like basically making it, it's very difficult to maintain them and run them. So they're in like highly specialized facilities and they're quite large. But this like quantum computing, I forget exactly what it's called, is already blowing the doors open on what's possible with computers. And it seems like something that over the next like 10 or 20 years, we're probably going to start hearing a lot more about, because just from the little bit I've like seen and read about them, it's some really exciting technological advancement kind of stuff. So this is again where Liu is peering past the point of which, you know, we're not supposed to be able to peer past, right? The singularity of like technology getting so advanced that it starts building on itself. You get computers like that being able to like figure out things that we never before thought possible to figure out. And that's what's being proposed here. I think it is notable that a lot of this stuff with the computer spreading out over a world, reflecting back the surface of the world, turning into a bunch of eyes that then peer down, and people reacting to it, this all takes place on Trisolaris, not on Earth in the books. And it was moved to Earth by the showrunners here, which I actually think is kind of an interesting choice. I mean, it makes it more visceral, and humanity is confronted with it all at once. It is a bit of a Pandora's box kind of situation of like, now you have to theorize about how the world would react. Yes. And that's a really interesting thing to get into.
Well, I was talking about that last week as well. Like when I early on felt like the flickering that we saw, the humanity didn't react in the way that I thought they would. I think it was so that when this happened, humanity would react. Because we get in the beginning of next episode, wars are breaking out and people, you know what I mean? They know that the aliens won't be here for 400 years, and yet everyone's losing their minds.
Mass suicides, like, you know, it's like an emergency. There's this run on all the supplies, including all the alcohol, which I thought was funny. We get that next episode. But like, I don't know, man. Like that's still highly theoretical, right? Like this, like, society doesn't fundamentally break, which honestly it might.
It might, yeah.
Like the idea that like power's still on and people are still going about their day to day at a certain point is quite a big assumption, you know, that people would return to their normal lives after a giant fucking eye appeared in the sky. It gets pretty chaotic, but again, like maybe underselling how chaotic it might really be. Although maybe the blinking sets up this moment a little bit. Like maybe you're getting slow played into it. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. I did notice that the opening sequence, which on Netflix is really interesting. Like I'm a big fan of opening sequences and intros, and I think that it really sets the tone for a show. Game of Thrones being a very, you know, pivotal example of that, of like people getting excited and the music being iconic. Yeah. So this one, notably, like the first episode, I think you get the entire run of this whole intricate intro, and then every other time it's like this very short, just like title. But I did notice in the title, the way that the three bodies, the three suns, all kind of line up with the planet in that final shot where three body problem comes up, looks a lot like an eye. And then after this episode, I was like, oh, that's a really cool way. I didn't catch that,
but now you mention it, yeah.
I was like, man, that's such a cool little Easter egg that was right in front of us the whole time. This eye looking out at us.
That's really cool, man. I love that he, like Liu, is proposing how these supercomputers might work and like how they might be used. Like that's such a wild thing, and yet like it's like well done. Like they also quantum entanglement is another thing brought up, which is a real thing. Cannot describe, you know, with any accuracy other than I know it is a real thing, and it's something that we're like very cutting edge starting to explore. So the idea is you get these things down to protons, and then you can entangle them with one another. You've made 4 of them, and they're entangled pairs, and that's how they're able to control them from the distance away that they are, which was a question we had. Like, how are they able to do this from the distance that they are away? And we got our answer, and it would happen immediately. Then the idea of, like, what would these computers be capable of? This is pure speculation. Like, how could we ever know? But I love this idea of like they sent it to fuck with our quantum experiments.
Well, at least subatomic, right?
Well, because it's all these particle accelerators. Like that's where all the science was breaking. So one of us, like specifically the task, it seems like of one was to like fuck with all the experiments to give everybody muddled data. And that's because, and it was interesting that they basically lay this out. But they say like, yeah, we show up and our whole goal is to stop your science in its tracks so that you can't continue to progress, because the whole idea of humanity's sort of what's it like continuing to like accelerate in a what's the mathematical term I'm looking for? Like it's like that parabolic sort of shape of like advancement, right? And how like we're rocketing forward, and so they're worried that we're going to be the more advanced society by the time they arrive.
Based on the fact that they have stable and unstable eras, they advance at a very steady rate, whereas we are like exponentially expanding.
Exponential. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. Yes. So that's their worry. And so they've sent one of these supercomputers, at the very least, maybe both of them, to stop that in its tracks as much as they can. And then the other one seems to be just like a fairly omniscient, but not completely, spy that is able to witness everything that's happening at all times. And that's something where it's like, that feels like magic, but also like we're talking about a supercomputer the size of a planet that has been shrunk to a proton, or proton size.
Envelopes the planet at one point, so you could, I guess, plausibly say that it kind of lays over everything, and it's because we can't see it, we can't perceive it.
It's capable of doing that, right? And yeah, I mean, like, and sometimes I feel like a little bit like, wow, that would be so powerful. That seems almost impossible to go up against, because like it does, right? But then I love that the secrets held within the own human mind becomes very important going forward, which we'll get to. But also, like, at times it feels like maybe they're not going far enough, because I'm like, couldn't it do like so much more than it's currently doing if it has like full control over everything essentially that it does? So it's interesting trying to set parameters on that, and that would be a real challenge as a writer of like, what are they actually capable of and what are they not? Would be very hard to define for yourself, I think, as you're writing this. But my hat goes off, because like it's so cool, and we've gotten not a lot of this in the book, but it is discussed a little bit. But especially them starting to fight back against it, we haven't gotten to really any of this yet in the book.
I did want to touch in on the sophons, in the way that like they, which are the supercomputers, they are simultaneously like these giant planet-sized supercomputers in the size, but then when they break them down into the size of a proton, and like they're able to then like fold them in on themselves, that and the quantum entanglement stuff of like basically like almost like wormhole communication, where like one of them is connecting to another one because of that quantum like on a different dimensional level, they've become connected. Those are the things that are like really fucking mind-blowing to me, that I just like sit and think about, and I'm like, oh.
And it's wild to think that that's all based on like some theoretical science, right? Like it's not just pulled out of the ass.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's an extrapolation, of course, right? But that's what science fiction does. It extrapolates out from like, if this is possible and this is possible, then what about this? You know, and that's what's happening so well here.
In addressing some of the differences between the book and the show as well, I've got to talk about the fact that like we see the Santi, like from their POV, basically they've given all of this information in one of the drives of like all of their story and like how they're doing all of this stuff, and we're actually like in essence in their POV in the book.
We get the POV of the one that Dr. Ya communicates with. The other side, like the pacifist, we get his perspective, or its perspective. I don't remember what pronoun
it's kind
it uses,
of
but
muddied because it's also like her interpretation of it in some way. So it's like it's not like directly 100% fact, but at the same time it seems that way, or at least I took it that way.
Well, and part of that is because of this POV that like we really only lately touched on, but like the entire book series, and it's called The Remembrance of Earth's Past. It's written for at some point in the distant future, in which all of this stuff has, in theory, played out, and now we're looking back at like the history of what happened to lead up to wherever the present currently is. Because of that, it feels kind of omniscient at times, but it's not truly. It feels like it's like I don't know, maybe it is like a supercomputer or something, like looking back at the history of what actually took place.
In this perspective, it's so interesting because we see him like get in trouble with his boss. They get in trouble with their boss, and like they're like basically they've betrayed their race because they've fallen in love with our race, with the human race.
They tried to protect us, which is, and we see how like brutal and like honestly authoritarian and kind of fascist that it seems like they are. I kind of like that we don't get as much of that in the show.
Yeah.
because it felt a little too human to me. I don't know, like it was still sufficiently alien to where I could buy it, and it was basically described that like they're such a brutal people because of their this
It's all
like
about
brutal threat to their
efficiency.
lives,
Yeah.
that it all becomes about efficiency and about like, yeah, like people are just sentenced to death like willy nilly. Like thousands of people are like, go burn in the courtyard, and
When they're not
um,
useful. Yeah. If they're deemed not useful.
or just for like, you were all like part of this mistake that this one person made, so we're just going to burn all of you, and including the one that that like the leader's talking to. She's like, you're too, you're also going to get burned. And it's just like, oh yes, of course, yes. I deserve it.
It is embrace it. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other major thing that we got to talk about here is at the end of this episode, the "You are bugs."
Yeah.
"You are bugs" is the last line, or one of the last lines of the book, and that shows up at the end of episode 5 here.
Yeah, so really episode 5 kind of gets us through the whole book, which is wild. I mean, there's little bits and pieces that get pulled out later, but like most of what happens beyond here, I assume, is in books 2 and 3, and with just a few things from book 1 sprinkled in. Yeah, it's wild how far along this goes. The "You are bugs" thing comes up. I did touch on this a little bit too with the communications, and how like the idea of pests and pests that are capable of being stomped on was introduced by old Mike Evans, and
Yep.
yeah, I think he fucked up pretty bad.
Dr. Ye also has continued to kind of fuck us over, but we'll get into more of her story now.
So real quick about that, like that's something that we don't explore a ton in the show, but in the book there's these 2 fractions within the ETO.
Well, 3. There's 3.
Oh yeah, there's 3. You're right. Yeah, so help me remember them. There's the
Adventists, I think.
Adventists, and those are the ones who want the aliens to come and wipe out humanity. Essentially, like, we all suck. Like, maybe a few of us live, but like the planet's yours. Take it over. And then what are the names of the other two? Reformists, yeah. So reformists want, that's what like Dr. Yab like kind of shifts to. Like
Kind
at
of
first
yeah.
was more of an Adventist, but then becomes this a little bit more later. And that's like, we can work together. Humanity will hopefully still maintain Earth, but we'll live sort of in harmony in some fashion. And then what was the last one? Survivalists. And describe that one.
They were the ones that basically were like most of like the people of lower class tiers were basically saying that they would be like servants and serve the but they would remain alive, but they would serve the Santi.
So that was a really interesting thing that I feel like we're probably going to get more of if this show continues on. Which, like, I don't know. I guess now's the time where I'll ask you: have they announced if this is going to get a season 2? Because I really hope so.
I heard online on the interwebs that they're looking for 4 seasons. They want to do 4 seasons of all 3 books. Yeah.
Interesting. So we're going to slow that pace down then a bit.
Yeah.
Maybe there are, I guess let us know in the comments if you know this. Like, I know that there are the 3 books, but are there other stories that Liu has put out that are like related to, like, how much other material could they bring into this, I guess is my question. It's like source material.
I have a sneaking suspicion that there's going to be time jumps because, it just seems
like it.
There's going to be some mass. I would assume the next book and maybe even the book after that just skip quite a few years and move us along. So it'll be interesting to see like if our main characters remain as relevant in further books.
Well, let's get into episode 6 because we got more technology and ideas to start bringing in here. If that wasn't enough for you, here we go.
So episode 6 is called "The Stars, Our Destination." The Eye in the Sky incident causes worldwide panic. Wade and the PDC Planetary Defense Council gather a group of experts to discuss how to intercept the Santi fleet. It is established that if a probe were to reach at least 1% light speed, it would intercept the incoming ships in 398 years, giving Earth 2 years advanced knowledge. Jin proposes the Staircase Project, using 1,000 nuclear bombs as propulsion sources for a probe with radiation sails. Based on Raj's performance in Panama, he is granted permission to join the PDC. Augie, repulsed by the deadly use of her nanofibers against Judgment Day, becomes depressed and reluctant to assist the PDC. Clarence asks Ye Wenji why Vera Ye committed suicide, to which she responds that Vera discovered her mother's dealings with the Santi through Ye Wenji's correspondence with Evans. Clarence releases Ye Wenji and assigns an officer to keep track of her whereabouts. Due to his illness and medication, Will hallucinates and reflects on his unrequited love towards Jin. As a result, he visits the Stars Our Destination Foundation to purchase the star DX3906 for her.
Yeah, so this is an interesting episode. I think it might be my least favorite of the series, but I will grant that it sets up some important emotional beats for characters, especially Will. But it felt the most ponderous to me. It felt the most like we've come down off of a really big moment, and now we're going to try and like settle back in and ground ourselves. Which I think, like, I understand the sort of urge to do that, but it bumped up against my believability again a little bit. Like, I liked the sort of mass panic, but if anything, it didn't quite go far enough. But it's okay. Maybe there'd be a way to sort of rein it in some. They talked about these mass riots, but I didn't think like there was enough explanation given for like what would actually be happening, because I feel like people wouldn't believe what they're being told. And that would be the key problem, is that I don't think people would be believing the government. And so a lot of these riots would be about like, tell us the truth, because there'd be all kinds of theories about it just proliferating like crazy. And people would be saying like, they're lying to us. What they said just happened is not what really happened. And I think a lot of these riots would be sort of motivated by that. And instead there's this kind of idea of just like, everyone's really scared, so they're rioting now. And like, there was no real like, I don't know, form or function to it. But I feel like it would be more likely specifically anti-government, like you are keeping the truth from us, is what I suspect a lot of these riots would be.
The show didn't really want to engage with it. It seemed like that much. Like they gave the enough at the beginning of the episode to say like, hey, the world's in panic, and they showed some riots and some battles and some wars breaking out, that kind of thing. Yeah. And just like people kind of head scratching, trying to figure out what's going on. But moves on from that pretty quickly, because I think it wanted to focus on this group of individuals we've been following.
So Will has inherited like $20 million or something from Jack, who died. And we see him drinking out of a 50-year-old Highland Park. I noticed.
Oh my God. I wrote that down too. And I was like, holy shit. I looked it up too. Do you know how much that costs?
I don't know, but I would guess, I don't know, $5,000, something like that.
$30,000.
$30,000. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's insane. But I mean, like, if you're dying and you got $20 million and you don't give a shit, like, maybe.
I'd give it a shot.
I would personally pour it in a glass, because I would just enjoy it more. As a Scotch drinker myself, I think you lose a little bit when you're drinking it right off the bottle. But there's sort of a baller aspect to that, and maybe that's what you're going for.
I think that's what it is. And like,
the fact that they were to do this,
the fact that they were drinking it, and he like hands it off to Saul, and like no one's reacting to it. I was like, holy shit, guys! Like, we're not going to address this, huh? We're just going to have a really expensive bottle in the frame.
Yeah, it's just there for people like us who like know and care about that kind of stuff. But ultimately, they're not going to linger on that for the show.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a cool little detail. I appreciate it. And I appreciate that it was a recognizable enough bottle to where I could tell it was Highland Park.
Yeah, right away.
Yeah, very cool. So we get a lot of this stuff about Will and his like hesitation to profess his love. We see a lot of Augie and Saul interacting here. And I think some of these character moments landed. Some of them missed a bit for me. I don't know. Some of it rang a bit hollow at times. What was your take on this episode? Like, how did you feel about it?
You know, I think in this episode, he like travels to try to see Jin, and then doesn't, and then like he keeps seeing her.
He gets there and he sees her talking to Raj, and he like backs up.
Yeah. And so there's like a few, it's really just like talking a lot about that, while showing us some of like the development of what Jin is doing with like the nukes and everything like that, trying to convince this council that this is like their best option. But yeah, I mean, I guess it definitely wasn't my favorite episode, but I didn't feel like I got bogged down on it too much.
Yeah, no, and I agree. Like, ultimately, even if it might have been the weakest, I think it's still, if this is the weakest, like the show is doing pretty well, because this was still an enjoyable enough episode. And I think it sets up a lot of what lands for me in the next episode.
Definitely.
One of the things that does get brought up here is the idea of the solar sail, which they call a radiation sail, which is another name for it. Won't surprise you to hear this is a very real thing that has been discussed. What I hadn't heard was this idea of detonating nuclear bombs to create radiation to like give little boosts to it. I was like, is this a real thing? And I looked into it, and the only thing I could find, just on my cursory looking, was like Reddit threads, like Ask a Physicist, where they were discussing this based off of this show. And Liu, I think, I'm not sure if this plays out exactly this way in the books or not, but they're like, is this possible? And like they were discussing it as a potentially, an option. One of the major problems is that you can't use nuclear weapons in this way based off of like world treaties about it. So currently there are laws against it, but that's addressed in the show, which I thought was cool. But it seems like kind of maybe.
Interesting. Yeah.
I've heard about lasers pushing solar sails, but essentially some sort of way to convey radiation. I do know that the more mass you have, the more difficult it is to get to these crazy speeds. But if you have a very low mass object, you actually can get quite fast and start to approach like a fraction of the speed of light. So I've heard this proposed as like a potential way to send probes to like nearby star systems and stuff, but if we can get everything worked out. So I was really excited to hear about this coming up in the show. And then the nuclear bomb thing, at first I was kind of like folding my arms. I was like, really, we're going to use nuclear bombs? That seems ridiculous.
We're all the council members that were like the highest physicists in the, they kind of turned their nose up and they're like, this is kind of hilarious Vin Diesel move you're trying to do here.
Yeah. And it kind of felt that way, but like, I'm pleased to say that when I looked into it, it was like, maybe. And I like my science in that category of like, it's potentially plausible. So like, let's play with it and imagine what would happen if we could do it.
That's kind of an interesting way that people will be like, okay, energy, what gives off a lot of energy? What's like the most energy we can create? And they start thinking in those terms. But it's also about like getting up to that speed, right? Like, it's not like they just need to get up to that speed and then the vacuum of space, they'll just continue at that speed.
Right. So specifically acceleration too.
Acceleration. Yeah. Getting there quickly. Man, it's like they talk about how difficult it would be to thread that needle and get everything correct. And I was very skeptical as they were setting everything up. I was like, good luck. But there have been some convenient things that have happened in the show. So I was like, the story in general. And I was like, maybe he just wants to explore that space and see what happens if it does work, Yeah.
And I was like, man, this sounds like a cool fucking idea. Like this stuff was exciting to me when I started hearing about it. I was like, wow, what are they going to send? Right. Was my big question. Because at this point we have no idea. They're just talking about sending something to intercept the fleet. So I was like, are they going to try and send a weapon? Like, what are they going to do here? Like, are they going to try and like, again, I think it's described as like take pictures. And then I'm like, how could they get them back? I don't know. This is very weird. But I was still sort of excited by the prospect. And then we end on Will buying a star.
Yeah, which I want to talk about that because we talked about splurging for 30 grand when you inherit millions. I'm not fucking buying a star for $19 million or whatever. Just
no
because.
Way. Yeah. No, not doing that. But I get the gesture here.
Of course,
and Will's a bit, he's looking for his like ways to profess love without actually doing it because he's convinced that it's going to like be unwanted, unrequited, and like
and it's eternal too, like the way that in terms of our perspective and everything like that, he's like doing something that will be last everything on earth probably and that kind of thing.
Although it doesn't though, because like the whole thing is so preposterous. You can't own a star. Like
exactly, that's why I wouldn't do it. Like they say, I think they say it's for a good
I think you can do this
right?
in real life right now for like $50.
Yeah,
I think you can do this kind of shit. Like it's not this expensive, but like they're doing it as like a
stocks are up once they find out that aliens exist. Stocks are through the roof, man. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean the whole idea is that you're more fundraising for the war effort because now all of humanity is starting to join forces and say we're under attack. What are we going to do? I kind of like this stuff, and I will say, speaking of that council, I was a little frustrated with the attitude of everybody there. That felt a little unrealistic to me of like, we got a bunch of people in the room sitting there with their arms folded going like, no way, this could never happen. And
you have to humor every single possibility. And the fact that like the smartest individuals in the world wouldn't,
exactly. If you get a bunch of scientists together who are like the smartest ones in the world, they're trying to tackle this problem, they're not going to be sitting there saying that for like anything. They're going to be excited about it and like talking about like, how can we make it work? Let's talk about these different ideas. And like, I don't know, it was a bit contrived to be overly dramatic, to make the scene dramatic. And like, I know some of that I'm like okay with because like it's TV ultimately and you gotta engage with everybody. But like every now and then I get a bit frustrated when it feels like we're sort of artificially adding in extra drama to a scene that doesn't need it, because to me the concepts are interesting enough to where that can carry it. I wanted to see something more akin to like the scientists or the engineers in the Apollo 13 film, which, you know what I mean, you get confronted with like the filter that breaks or whatever it is on the spaceship, and they're like, well, we got to solve the problem, here's the materials we have, let's do it. And like the like sense of like team and like we got to tackle this problem as impossible as it seems. And I feel like scientists would be more like that. Maybe I'm being optimistic, but I just feel like there would be like, among the scientists, there would be a lot of like an effort to work together and figure this thing out. If maybe the other people in the room might be more skeptical about certain laws, maybe that were going to be broken or certain things being feasible or not. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's a minor criticism, but again, these were some of these things where it just felt like they were kind of artificially pumping in some drama to a scene that didn't really need it.
Well, to talk about some stuff that I thought was actually pretty genuine drama and emotion too, is like the stuff with Will as we move along, we're seeing a dying man, and he's like kind of like he's inherited this money, and it's brought up like, why don't you go see other oncologists? Why don't you all these other things? And he's like, no, I've gotten a second opinion. Like he knows kind of his fate at this point, and so he's like trying to enjoy life, and then just like kind of that's everyone on Earth basically. If we think 400 years from now there's this alien coming to kill you, like everyone can react multiple different ways, and Will is one of those reactions of like, well, look at the time we have here, and like let's enjoy what time we've been given, kind of thing.
And this is what I was talking about a little bit with one of those misdirects, because I thought that was the extent of why we were dealing with this thing, is this ongoing metaphor for like, how do you deal with a diagnosis like this, and if all of humanity got a diagnosis, all the different reactions there would be, like the people who want to fight versus the people who want to give up, and like all these different things, right? And like, I was like, okay, this is cool, but like we're spending a lot of time on it, was kind of my feeling, right? Like it as like a metaphor. So I was like, okay, hopefully we're kind of done with it. But then, let's get into the next episode, because I think I love the reveal of like, no, this is actually all very important potentially for the science aspect of this.
So the next episode is called Only Advance. The ownership certificate of star DX3906 is sent anonymously to Jin. Wade demonstrates cryogenic technology to PDC members, reviving a chimpanzee who had been in cryosleep. He plans to enter cryosleep himself to be present when the Santi arrive in 400 years, stating that humanity can, quote, only advance. Due to insufficient nuclear bombs for use of propulsion, the maximum payload of the interstellar probe will only be able to hold a human brain. Augie makes her nanofiber research public and leaves the country. Given Will's imminent death from cancer, Wade suggests he fill the candidacy as the brain in the Staircase Project. Ye Wenji meets with Saul and attempts to pass on her knowledge about cosmic sociology in the form of a joke that the Santi will have difficulty deciphering, saying, "Don't play with God." Will consents to the Staircase Project and is euthanized with Saul at his side. Jin, discovering DX3906 was a gift from Will, rushes to the hospital only to find his brain has already been extracted. Ye Wenji flies back to China and visits the Red Coast dish site, where she encounters Tatiana, who kills her on orders from the Santi.
Yeah, so here's our penultimate episode, and I think in true Game of Thrones fashion, it's a really good one.
Yes.
I love this episode. And I think it's going to land us at our game, one of our few recurring segments. Would you do it?
Would you do it?
I kept thinking about that question, man. And I kind of went through a journey with it, so I just want to talk about it with you. So the idea is the Staircase Project is going to send a human brain to the Santi.
Got very Futurama in my head. I was like, okay, so we're just cutting off heads and they're going to continue living. And
well, so we talk about all these different real sciences, like cryogenic freezing of brains is a very real science that they are working on right now. Is it perfected yet? No, but the idea is that one day it may be. So of course, even today you have a bunch of people freezing their brains in hopes to be revived in the future. And there is a lot of evidence that this could be feasible at some point, and I'm not like an expert enough to tell you where we're at with this technology, but I know it is a thing that actively being developed. So I love the idea of just like, all right, this is now a thing that is possible. So if it's possible to do this, which is demonstrated by the chimpanzee, I think, we are going to have the ability to send a person. And then so the question becomes, who do we send? Nobody wants to like give up their life to do it. So they're like, well, we need somebody who's potentially terminal. And we have the perfect candidate in Will. They go to talk to him and they try and get him to sign. Wade tries to get him to sign this like agreement that he was never going to do anything that goes against like humanity's best interest. And he refuses to sign it. And I love that, like, I don't know if Wade figures it out in the moment or if he always planned this. It's a little unclear, but like he ends up actually being perfect because he's like, that actually makes it much more likely that they will pick you up that you refuse to sign that contract.
He has morals too. Like that means like he's willing to stand by what he believes in and that kind of thing too. So,
and he refuses to sign it because he says like, maybe they're better and I'll get there and I'll be like, no, actually you guys are great. Like you should take over the earth. And like, he wants to leave that as a possibility for himself. Which it was really interesting to do that. So getting back to our game, my definition for it is the parameters of will. You are dying. You are a candidate for this because of your knowledge that you are capable of doing this potential job.
Yeah.
And I love the one of my favorite parts of this whole thing was the scene with him and Saul as he is sort of going through this process of like self euthanization.
Yeah, it's like a confirmation,
Yeah, you have to
multi-step
hit it 5
confirmation.
times. I think this is like a pretty real depiction of this, which in like certain areas in other countries, maybe certain states here, I'm not sure. Like this is a legal practice. And you know, I wonder if this is probably pretty accurate to how that goes. But regardless, I thought it was well displayed here. And then I love that Saul comes in and has some really good points that I hadn't been considering when I first got hit with this. About like why you might not want to do this.
Yeah.
And he brings up some really interesting counterpoints. So my question to you ultimately, James, is have you thought about it and what would you do in this situation? Would you agree to do it?
Knowing what we know as a whole, the idea of cryogenically freezing my brain and potentially having it be revived later and a new body built, everything like that. Yes. Now, the very specific parameters of this happening are
specifically
that he's going to be
being
put
sent to the
in a rocket, basically sent all the way across the 4 light year, however many light years it is.
Yeah.
And then possibly be revived by another species who, like Saul says, may experiment on you, may turn you into their pet, may just try to see the limits of what traumatic things you can go through.
Right.
No, I'm not fucking doing that. I'm absolutely not doing that. And then the other thing is like the entire time, especially knowing kind of the full breadth of what we get in this series, is like it could fucking go wrong and then you're just a fucking brain floating in space, which isn't that different because you're obviously cryogenically frozen.
Yeah, you don't perceive that.
You don't perceive that, but at the same time, there's something very like claustrophobic about like the idea of you just not being in some natural ending of some kind. I don't know. There's something that kind of sticks with me a little bit. Nothing religious. I know that that's like probably where some other people may take it.
Yeah.
Nothing like that because I don't believe in any of that. But it's more so like it's unsettling. It's unnatural.
Yeah, man. So my initial reaction when I heard about this was like, "Fuck yeah." Put me in. Like I was with Will, you know, like, and I was actually a little frustrated. I will note, when it comes up, they jump over the reveal. Like we don't hear Will hear about it for the first time. Like I wanted to see that happen. Like, and I know that sometimes this happens in TV and movies where they skip over it because ultimately, I guess you're going over some material that we've already covered. But like, man, I missed that reaction. I wanted to see his reaction to this moment. But regardless, my initial reaction was like, "Fuck yeah, sign me up." And then we got to the scene with Saul. And he makes some really compelling points. And so like I kind of sat with it for a while and really thought about it. And ultimately, I think I landed the same place that Will does. I think I'm kind of with him. Like I'm glad that Saul brought it up because I would want to have considered those things.
Mm-hmm.
But the chance to do something like truly great in this moment, and the fact that like you're facing death regardless. And I agree with you. To me, like you're facing oblivion. And so the idea of like if you miss or whatever and you're like a frozen brain in space, like it's oblivion. So it's no different. But there's the chance that maybe you get there and something amazing happens. Maybe you get there and you get another shot at life, or maybe you get there and it's utter hell. Like it's a hell beyond conception.
Yeah.
What's funny about this to me is that this is kind of a metaphor for what a lot of religious belief is, right? And belief in the afterlife of like, depending on like what you believe about the afterlife, maybe you have an eternal reward or eternal damnation waiting for you. So this is almost setting up a very scientific afterlife for Will. You know, if you get there. So ultimately for me, like I think I would still do it, but like I wasn't as full throated. I definitely had some like reservations about it after what Saul said because I think he brings up some really excellent points. But man, was it a fun exercise to think about. And you know, maybe I'll feel differently at different times. I don't know. I'm going to come back to this one though, but like, I think I still would have done it. And I think I would have been with Will on this one. You know, he seems to have a lot of like love reasons for it. I think mine would be a little bit more broad than that.
Yeah. Well, you get to be like an explorer, right? You get to be like a first to do that kind of thing and leave a legacy of that. And
you're going to be you could potentially be one of the most important people to ever live, which like ultimately that's an ego thing. So it's like, does that matter? I don't know. But like, you also could be really helpful, right? Like you could be one of the most like beneficial people to ever live. And maybe not. Maybe you will end up being a pet, but like you just don't know. I don't know.
What if they revive you and then you just turn into John McClane in their ship and you're just fucking wrecking their you're taking them down from the inside.
I'm hiding in the rafters, just waiting to jump down. Now I got a machine laser gun.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we got to move on. Another big point here that comes up is this joke.
Yeah,
So
love this stuff.
Einstein joke. Pretty funny, interesting one, right? I'm not going to go through the whole thing because it's actually quite a long setup. Um, and at the end, we get the message of don't mess with God, or don't play with God.
Playing music in heaven with God. That's the gist of it.
And this was between Saul and Dr. Yeah, right? And she says, like, she says something like, I hope my joke doesn't bring you any trouble. Which I thought was really like
So good.
ominous. And I was like, uh-oh. And like, true enough, like I think this is what is setting into motion Saul's journey to becoming a Wallfacer, which is something we only get mentioned here and we'll get into next episode. But this joke, like, what did you make of this? Like, why is this important? Any guesses?
I think she's expressing her level of she's seeing the error of her ways in some sense. Like, I think she's saying, like, she's a great character, right? Like, she at the same time wants this alien race to take down the human race and reset things, but it's gone too far now. Now she's like, oh shit, it's gonna completely wipe us out, and that's not necessarily what she was wanting. And so, like, in hindsight, she's kind of giving him information also, and just everyone information of, like, start thinking of ways to navigate spreading ideas amongst ourselves without them being able to perceive it, because that's the weapon that we have left at our disposal. Is they clearly don't understand stories and lies and, like, jokes, irony, all this stuff. They don't get it, and that's something that's, like, entirely humanity
That's
developed.
a good point. Telling a joke is a very human way to convey something. So they don't understand it.
So I think she's at the same time as she's saying, like, hey, listen, I'm basically telling the aliens right now, because they're watching, that you're an important figure and this is probably going to fuck you over. But at the same time, like, if you use this correctly, what I'm telling you right now could be used as a weapon against them at some point. So, you know, start thinking outside the box, and then that's kind of what these Wallfacers, what they kind of represent as well, in a little bit.
So at the end of the episode here, we get Jin running to the hospital to try and be there before Will dies, and his brain separated from body. Doesn't get there in time, but she seems to realize something, and it's when part of the revelation about this being a star gifted to her. What do you think she realizes here? What was motivating this run back? Just that she realizes that he loved her, or he had kind of said that already. So, like, what was it about this reveal you think that motivated her?
I thought it had to do with, like, a proper goodbye kind of thing, and, like, realizing, like, this is at the same time an experiment, because I think that she was thinking of it. She was so wrapped up in the fact that it's an experiment that she's having to pull off.
Yeah.
And like, he obviously made this decision, and it seems like it's for the greater good, but ultimately at the end she's like, we're people, and, like, our perception of our lives is really just, like, while we're here, and, like, he's about to be gone.
Yeah, so I think for me, my guess is that she is thinking that Will is doing this for her. And that was the realization, I think, for her, of, like, not only does he love me, but he is signing up to do this specific thing because of that love for me. And so I think in this moment she feels responsible for what's happening. And so I think she's hoping to talk him out of it, because she doesn't want that on her conscience, and probably feels like if that's the reason he's doing it, then he shouldn't do it. I don't know that that's true, or even if it is true, like, that should matter. But I can understand if that's her motivation. I kind of like that it wasn't really laid out in explicit terms. But that was me sort of reading between the lines and sort of what I think is going on here.
Yeah, and this all of this stuff worked really well for me. His conversation with Saul that he's having simultaneously while she's running to try to get there, which is funny because, like, of course she could call the hospital, she could call Saul, she could, but she decides to run there without saying anything. And it's like, I mean, I felt myself tearing up, and I was like, man, this is like a really interesting way to navigate a tragedy. Like, everyone's life ends in tragedy, like that ultimately is what it is everyone dies, leaving people behind, and it's always kind of a tragedy at the end. And, like, seeing a show like this that in the book was decidedly very, like, macro, it was like looking at it all kind of from the perspective of, like, look at these huge earth shaping, like earth changing events, and then getting this side to the story. And I don't know if this is something that Liu has in a later book, and if it's, like, this intimate, but it really helps to, I think, flesh out the story and make it feel more layered. And yeah, like I said, that run and his actual like final conversation and the way he's like kind of counting it down, and Saul is almost like pleading with him not to do it and kind of consider other alternatives. It's heavy. It's really
Yeah.
and I think it was really powerful.
Agreed, man. All right, let's get into the next episode though, because it definitely has an effect on what we just saw.
Yeah, so episode 8 is called Wallfacer. After a one-night stand, Saul's lover gets hit by an errant car and dies in front of him. Clarence's investigations reveal that it was a Santi assassination attempt, with Saul as the intended victim. Saul is taken into protective custody and flown to the United Nations, where the Wallfacer project is announced. Saul is selected as one of 3 Wallfacers who are tasked to develop a plan to defeat the Santi, contained entirely within their own minds, as the Santi are unable to read minds. Saul tries to reject his position and leaves the UN only to be shot by a sniper. He's unharmed thanks to his bulletproof clothing and reconsiders why the Santi want him dead. Wade and Jin oversee the Staircase project, where Will's cryogenically frozen brain is launched into space, in hope that the Santi will intercept and reconstruct his body with it. Shortly after the detonation sequence starts, the sail malfunctions and sends the probe off course. The Santi taunt and frighten Wade for his failure. Clarence takes a despondent Jin and similarly depressive Saul to see a swarm of cicadas, insects that have survived despite humanity's decades-long attempts to eradicate them, implying humanity has the same resilience.
A couple of things to talk about here. First off, I mentioned earlier that like the parameters of what the sophons are capable of is one that is like a little tricky. And like to me, it seems like if they wanted to kill Saul, they could in a much easier fashion than this. The idea of like this very like final destination-y setup for multiple autonomous vehicles crashing into each other and then it not even working. I'm like, I don't know. It just seems like there are easier ways. Again, he's like flying on planes later. Couldn't they just bring down a plane whenever they want? Like, I don't know. I'm again like maybe there's reasons they want him alive, but they want him to think that they want him dead. Like, is that what the game they're playing? Because otherwise, I don't see why he would live. Why if they decided they wanted him killed, it seems like they could easily do that.
I mean, they later have a sniper shoot him, so it's like they, any kind of thing like that could have been happening from the beginning.
Yeah. But also very specifically not shoot him in the head, which like interesting choice again. Like, I don't know. It's fascinating, but it's like part of me wants to say, okay, let's settle that aside and assume they do want him dead. And it's because they've now identified him as a potential candidate for this Wallfacer program, which they would know that Wade was developing because they've been able to watch Wade. But he arrives and he gets named as one of these Wallfacers in a way that, again, this is one of the things I will continue to criticize this show for. Unnecessarily dramatic moment of him not being told anything until he's literally called up on stage to be named this. Like, they try and explain it away later of like, well, if we told you why you were being brought, you wouldn't have come. But like, he literally doesn't know why he's in the room. He doesn't know anything until his name is called. It just felt unnecessary. Like, why would you do that? Like, give the dude a heads up in some fashion, but like it's to make the moment, I guess, a little more dramatic. Yeah. But all that being said, this idea of the Wallfacer program is really fascinating. This is the thing that I just kept thinking about. I'm like, such a cool scenario we've set up, and such an interesting response to this somewhat omniscient supercomputer who's observing everything and spying on us constantly. The idea of having 3 humans who are sort of above all governments, above all power structures. They get to do whatever they want without question. It's a really cool idea to counter this very specific alien supercomputer setup that Liu has described. But then the other layer to it that is, I think, equally fascinating is that as a thematic element, it's actually pretty troubling because it seems to be sort of in service of or like excusing authoritarian figures of like someone who knows best having ultimate power in this situation seems to be a good thing. I don't know, like, because I feel like you could read it that way, right? And say like, this is actually a really dangerous thing that Liu is proposing here. And I agree in the context of like a normal world, but in the very hyper-specific context of this world, it's like a brilliant way to counter the setup we have. So it's one of those where it's like the reality of the fiction and the reality of like the thematic element that like people will take away from this kind of are in conflict with each other. And like, I don't know, what do you feel? What do you think about this Wallfacer stuff?
I think it's really interesting because the idea of someone having this much power, like in granting, someone chose them to be, you know what I mean? Like, so those people are immediately in power because they appoint these people and they are making the decisions. Again, you're basically putting people back in the situation of Ye Wenji, where she's making a deciding decision that's gonna affect all of humanity, and no one else has any say over it. And that kind of like, for that it to come back around to that is really interesting. And I'm wondering, like, why don't they just go in a dark room and all get under blankets where clearly the AI is not going to be able to see, and then write notes to each other? And then that's how they communicate with that. Or like they mentioned doing like the moon-based thing. I'm like, yeah, do something like go into, I refuse to believe that they wouldn't do other things with, like, by launching a rocket and then also having nukes go off in order to send something out there. I refuse to believe that they're not willing to also send people to space and try to travel away from the watchful eye of these AI and then come back. And I know they say something about the moon being like 3 minutes of travel or something like that.
I think they are doing that because like Raj is signing up for this moon mission. So I think they are going to be, the whole point is like they're going to be running a bunch of these experiments, and the hope is that they can at least busy one of the sophons, if not both. And I do think the implication is that the more we can tax the sophon's ability to fuck with our experiments, the less the sophons will be able to spy on us. Like they won't be as omnipresent, but they will probably be at very like specific meetings that they know are hyper important, right? And like around for certain events. I assume you're being sort of
of course.
Joking with the dark blankets, because of course that wouldn't do anything. But it's a fascinating idea. I like the idea of like there's like an imperceptible thing going on with the brain where like even a supercomputer can't read a mind and like figure out what is actually happening inside the brain. Is that true? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. But that's being proposed as true here. And I like that. It does feel like it could be true. And so like the essential humanness of these Wallfacers is what makes them an effective tool. Again, the social element and the thematic element of this is potentially troubling because it seems to back up the idea of like supreme power residing in one person who knows best. And like, as we've seen time and again throughout history, this is actually a very bad thing. Putting supreme power in any one person that we think might know best. You know, the sort of wise king myth has perpetuated throughout time. And, you know, it's interesting because like that part of me says like this is all dangerous, I don't like it, but like the other part of me is like, but we've set up a really cool sci-fi situation where this is like maybe the only way to combat it. So like ultimately I still like it.
I really thought that
it makes me a little uncomfortable.
I really thought that these like geniuses were gonna be quicker on the uptake though, as far as them not understanding the jokes and like that kind of thing that I was setting up before. And like, so I thought that all of these scientists were just gonna be like talking about theoretical physics and things like that in joke format. I thought they were just going to turn into comedians on stage doing their Type 5.
That would be funny, right?
Yeah.
Everything's got a punchline, but the punchline is actually the answer to something.
It's all misdirection, so that they can't figure out what's happening.
Who knows what kind of games we might get in the future. I did kind of like, I thought it was a little drawn out again, but like the whole thing of like Saul being like, I'm not a Wallfacer. I said no. You told everybody I said no. I'm not this, but like, he is. Like, clearly it's like he can't, this is not something you can say no to. You've been dubbed a Wallfacer and now you are one. And it takes him a little while to kind of catch on to like this is a thing, but like maybe he's just having like a denial about it.
And I kind of thought that was in line with what I was talking about there, where like he's saying they don't, I think they can perceive them, but they can't lie or something like that. That's kind of what's been set up with these Santi. And so like him saying like, I'm not is like it's opposite day. He's like, I'm not a Wallfacer.
Yeah. Well, I did love how they were all doing the little smile at him. And like, he's like, is everyone going to be like that to me from now on? And it's like, yeah. It was very funny. I don't know. It's a really fascinating concept, man. I like it. I'm really excited to see like why Saul? That's the ultimate question, right? Like these other two people are really influential, important people that were chosen seemingly for good reasons. And then you got Saul, and like the only thing we got to go on is that he knows everybody. He's supposedly like the smartest of them all, I've been told. And then like he had this conversation with Dr. Yeah, which he heard the Einstein joke. Maybe that was important. Because she did say like, I hope it doesn't get you into trouble. So like if this is somehow connected, it could be. But yeah, ultimately I'm just excited to see what Saul ends up doing with this power that he has now. He doesn't ever have to talk about what he's thinking, and in fact explicitly should not talk about what he's thinking with anyone. Like you can't brainstorm with anybody. It all has to take place inside your mind. So we can't ever get we can't get scenes where like Saul's going to be talking out his plans with anybody. Like it just can't happen.
It's going to be like a diary scene. He's going to be like sitting down and it's going to be like, dear diary.
He can't.
Like in his mind though. It's his
mind diary. Yeah. I mean, maybe we'll get voiceover. It could be a thing, but we haven't gotten any of that so far. And I kind of think it'd be cooler to not, because he's going to become a very mysterious figure, I think, right?
Yeah.
Having supreme power and never explaining his reasons for anything.
Right. And this episode, while the rocket stuff felt very relevant to what was just happening, this bit with the Wallfacer did feel like it was kind of like, it was definitely brought in from another story, it feels like. From another
This feels like book 3 stuff or something.
But it almost like, with that being in the final episode, felt so like jarring with just tonally and like the pacing of where we were ending up. I did like a lot of the concepts and the things that we were getting, but the stuff that we got at the end of 7 felt like kind of a finale, and then it felt like the rocket stuff was all that was left to do, and then they introduced this new concept here in the last episode, and I get that that's kind of enticing people to come back for more seasons.
Yeah, I think it shows, like, because like the final scene in the book it's locusts, but here it's the cicadas, and the whole idea is that like, yeah, we might be bugs, but like, look at how bugs are thriving on Earth and how we haven't been able to eradicate them and how plentiful they are. And like, it's like a moment of like, we might be bugs, but we could still fight back. And like, our loss is not assured. Introducing the Wallfacers gives that a little more teeth to me, because otherwise it's just like, yeah, maybe. But like the Wallfacers as a concept to fight against the supercomputer is a really cool one. And it makes me feel a bit like, yeah, maybe we do have a shot. That's undercut by the way they fuck with Wade on the plane, because again, quite clearly they're like, we're gonna fuck with everything you see. Like at this point, he can't trust anything he's seeing. He's also developed this. We haven't talked about. He just developed this idea where he's gonna get like periodically frozen, and he's gonna like jump ahead in time.
Yeah.
I'm interested to see how that plays out.
I think that could be cool.
Fascinating idea.
Yeah.
It does seem like you would quickly be left behind. Like, I don't know how you would stay like up to date, and I don't know. I feel like eventually you would become outdated. No one would want to listen to you anymore because you're this like person from another era who's just artificially stuck around.
Yeah.
But who knows? I'll be curious to see how it plays out. It's a fascinating idea. And again, like the Santi have repeatedly like re-emphasized their power, and they are playing games of their own. Tatiana has been given a VR headset, which seems like she's going to be like one of their main communication points now. And they have a person. They have more than that, because we see the sniper. There are definitely more of these people out there that they can control. I'm really excited for another season, but we got to talk about the stuff with Will, because I didn't see this coming. I thought this was going to work. I was really interested to see, and like I was kind of gutted, but then it also felt like a really just bold narrative decision to have, after all this buildup, it goes wrong, and Will goes off course. Now, somehow is he gonna come back? I kind of think yes, but like maybe not. It is kind of deflating, but and tragic in that sense, and it would definitely be, but really fascinating. I still stand by everything I said about my decision, because I knew that this was a possibility, but ultimately he was going to die anyway. So
I think that in having the story end like this, it like kind of reemphasizes the hard science aspect of it. Is like the things that are outside of your control will happen in experimentation in science. Like these are variables that, yes, you can plan for, but things are going to happen. And like the idea, this was such a harebrained, like don't get me wrong, brilliant, right? But at the same time, Vin Diesel in Fast and the Furious, like this is like, we're gonna take this and we're gonna shoot it, and then we're gonna go through the nukes, and like they talked about
maybe
threading.
will be good for us if he does make there, which they don't even know. Yeah,
it was like threading the needle 300 times, she said, perfectly, and like all of the, like, knowing how difficult that is to have it not go perfectly. I think it kind of gives the world realism in it, and it gives it like a level of like, okay, anything can happen, and like that, having that available in your story, especially something that's more grounded and like hard sci-fi.
Well, things go wrong in these kind of operations all the time that are much less elaborate than this.
Right.
And that's just a reality, especially the idea that the first time you ever attempt it, it's going to work. And that's what Wade kind of says. He's like, well, there'll be other candidates. It doesn't work the first time. And it just hurts, because we knew Will and we liked him and we wanted to see what was going to happen. Again, maybe they'll find a way to rope him back in, but
Yeah.
it doesn't seem possible. But then again, lots of things that didn't seem possible became
Yeah.
possible in this show. So
A lot of quantum wormhole. Oh, another thing I want to talk about with this proton stuff is they talk about taking it to like the 0th dimension, like this ruler of the Santi of some kind, or some important figure is talking to the
Yeah.
scientists and the military people, and this is in the book. He says it like, what would happen if we did this, and then they very quickly are like, that's not a command, abort command, because if that was about to start happening, they talk about how like that would then fold in on itself and then create like a basically a black hole. And how wild that is.
Is that our new Chekov? Is that our new Chekov's gun?
I don't know. Maybe.
I think you might be right, honestly, because if we're talking about how these things might be defeated one day, if you could force them to do that, but then you're also creating black holes, so those are quite dangerous forces in the universe.
Seems like it could kind of distort gravity and reality around you and absolutely obliterate you. But
I could totally see us getting into like black hole theory at some later point in this series. So I think that's actually a smart thought. That
so
could
we just
be something.
wormhole out to Will wherever he's at. They'll pinpoint him, wormhole out, wormhole.
Could we
right
get
back.
into wormholes? Maybe. I mean, they're highly theoretical concepts, but like clearly Liu is willing to engage with like everything's on the table.
Yeah.
And I love the way that even like material sciences and like nanotech and cryogenics and stuff like that is also all part of this. Like he's found a way to like fold all these different really cool concepts into it. I'm loving that, man. But I think here at the end, it's time, if you're ready, to cast our vote on what we ultimately liked better, book or show. I have already sort of outlined how like we only read book 1 and the show got into later books. So I think that muddies the waters a bit, but granting all of that, do you want to kick things off? How are you feeling?
If you had asked me this question at the first half of the show, I would have said the book. I thought that the book was just it was a lot more rich. I felt like the characters, while sparse, were like kind of operating in a world that I found to be more interesting. And then the show felt more familiar. And there was something about that I was like, I kind of wanted this to be something new. But as the show progressed, it got more complex. And I ended up really liking the way that the characters knit together. And once, like we said before, they started on their own paths, I really saw like the trajectory of where they were going, or at least I thought maybe they may be going. And it felt like much more engaging. And I was really sucked in, and I was watching these episodes back to back to back. And I did like how we got these really wacky perspectives of like the Santi on their world and dealing with their own politics and how they're fallible and they have very, human-like tendencies, and how maybe that's just an inevitability of humanity, of any like race or any group of beings. But I love the way that he experiments with these concepts and brings new things to me. As I said in a previous episode, I love like gamifying knowledge, like tricking me. You said like tricking me into learning something.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. Yeah, give me more of that. But ultimately with this, I'm going to take the show, and I'm so surprised that I'm saying that because, coming in with the baggage of Weiss and Benioff, I was very skeptical.
All right, man. Yeah, I mean, I'm also pretty torn on this one. The way I think I ultimately come down to it is I kind of recommend these in concert. I think they're a good pairing. I do think if you're really into the science, I think there's probably more meat for you in the series. And I'm extrapolating out from what I assume it happens in later books. I haven't read them yet. But it seems like to me, if you really want to get down into like the nitty gritties of the science, that's going to be probably the best place for you. But if you're okay with just like more of a conceptual understanding of the 3-body problem and a lot of the science that goes into it, I think the show is doing a pretty solid job with that. I have my criticisms of it, but I also have some criticisms of the book. There were times where like we were going on and on about some of these concepts, about like the supercomputers and stuff, and my eyes were starting to glaze over. I will totally admit, as I'm trying to read this, it's like, this is getting pretty dry. The characters aren't super well-rounded and interesting at all times. They have their moments, don't get me wrong. But like that's not, I wouldn't say a strength of the Liu novel is like the characterization, even though there are really cool moments. Whereas I think the show has done a pretty good job with that. It's not perfect. I don't think all the characters are necessarily like winning me over as like iconic characters I'm going to remember forever. But they grew on me over time, and I like them all to an extent. I have to admit, like as someone who is from the West, right? Who had never read the series before. Ultimately, I think I'm going to choose the show, but I'm going to continue to say that this is one where I think you need to, if you want to have the full experience, do both. But I am slightly preferring the show right now, and it pains me to say because I also know that like this was a Chinese creator. There's a Chinese show out there. There's a lot of politics around it being westernized in the way that it was. So it's just a very hyper specific. All I can do is speak for myself and say that I'm really liking this show more right now, just slightly more, but ultimately more. So that's where we're gonna leave this one. Stick around to the very end of the episode, and we'll announce our next project, which will be coming up. If you enjoyed this episode and our coverage in general on Three Body Problem, leave us a comment, like the video, make sure to subscribe. We're like creeping ever closer to 1,000 subscribers, which is like a big number on YouTube. So anything you can do to help us get there, greatly appreciated. And if you're listening on audio, make sure to leave us a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. That also helps us out.
And be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film. We're also on Blue Sky and TikTok, so keep an eye out.
And if you'd like to support this podcast in another way, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/inktofilm, where we release bonus episodes every month. We'll be doing one this month. I think we're going to talk about the Fallout show. Both of us have been texting about how we've been watching it. So if you're curious to know what we think about a video game adaptation, recent one, Patreon is going to be the space to be for that. So definitely support us on there, and we'd love to have you.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, man. So that's it. Let's go ahead and announce our next project. It's one that has been a long time coming, and that's Alice in Wonderland Through the Looking Glass. Lewis Carroll. We're going to go back and also watch the original, I think, cartoon animation, the Disney one, I believe.
Yeah, and we're both gonna get super fucked up for it. We're gonna be psychedelic, and we're gonna be like the caterpillar. We're just be puffing all over the place.
Yeah, it's such an iconic, title and project. It's been referenced so many times, like it metaphors for like all different kinds of going down the rabbit hole. Like there's so many things I think to get into, and I know it's got this like sort of sordid history about its creation. There's gonna be a lot to dig into with the book, which is what our next episode will be on. So if you're interested in that, make sure to stick around. Again, subscribe to the channel and pay attention for that. But I guess that's going to be it for our Three Body Problem, at least for now. I will say if they return with future seasons, this is one I would be excited to potentially continue with, because I really want to read this next book.
Yeah, I want to know what happens next. I have no idea like where this could possibly go, because it's going to go for 400 years of human history possibly. So
maybe
we'll
maybe the series ends at a certain point. Like I don't know. I'm really fascinated to see. I'm amazed at Liu's continued ability to surprise me.
Yeah.
So that's exciting stuff.
Make sure to stay strong out there, bugs. We're just little bugs against this universe. We got to stick together.
Yeah. To all my fellow bugs, until next time.
Keep adapting.